Mark chapter 6, we'll start reading in verse 45 through 56 this morning. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost, and cried out. For they all saw him and were terrified, but immediately he spoke with them, and said to them, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. And when they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. And when they got out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him and ran about the whole country and began to carry here and there on their pallets those who were sick to the place they heard he was. Wherever he entered villages or cities or countryside, they were laying the sick in the marketplaces and imploring him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak, and as many as touched it were cured. This morning I want to spend some time just looking at chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. This is one of the most amazing miracles that stands out in this section, a section which I would title Jesus' self-disclosure to the 12. And next week we'll come and talk about this, but this is a period near the end of his Galilean ministry. We're going to find him withdrawing several times from Galilee into other regions. If you turn with me to chapter 7 and note with me in verse 24, "And Jesus got up and he went away from them to the region of Tyre, and he entered a house and wanted no one to know of it. Yet he could not escape notice." We find reference again in verse 31 that he went out from the region of Tyre and he came through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee within the region of Decapolis. We will start to find him make these withdrawals throughout this section. And at the end of chapter 6, verses 53 through 56 are a summary statement sort of closing out the end of his Galilean ministry, giving us a synopsis of what that looked like and all the different encounters that he had. But this is a crucial time in the life of the disciples. The transition is going to come in chapter 8 with the confession of Peter, and Jesus is going to move towards Jerusalem. But this is a period in where he is going to reveal to his disciples certain things they need to know. And it really begins with the feeding of the 5,000, and we'll find the connection between that and this episode this morning. But this is such an important section for us, because there were things that they needed to understand about the Messiah, things they didn't grasp. And next week, I hope that you will all be here, because one of the things that you'll notice with Mark's gospel is that he likes writing in duplicates. He likes the twos. Luke likes twos, but he does it for a different reason. In Mark's gospel, we'll find the feeding of the 5,000 in chapter 6. Then in chapter 8, we're going to have the feeding of the 4,000. We've already seen the disciples in the boat in the midst of a storm in chapter 4 at the end of the chapter. Here again, we find them in the midst of the storm in a boat, and Jesus is going to encounter them. We see these groupings like this, and we start to ask ourselves, why does Mark do this? Next week, I'm going to answer the question, because I think it's very important as we move into this next section of this self-disclosure that Jesus is going to bring forth for them. But there are two themes that run through this episode and the previous episode. The first one is this: the supernatural power of Jesus. Mark continues to build this portrait of Christ, and he is continuing to reveal him. Although we see him walking, although we see him eating or not eating, although we see him sleeping, we see him feel compassion, we see the humanity, but at the same time, we find that he is not an ordinary human being. There's something distinct and unique about him. This miracle is going to really bring this out. We're going to find the disciples are astonished, but we'll find that that astonishment remains within. They give no expression to it like in the previous episode. This is an amazing miracle, and we'll talk about the attacks upon it throughout time and history. The second theme is this, though, and it corresponds with the first one. As Mark unfolds this portrait of Jesus Christ, that there is something unique about him and the supernatural character of Jesus Christ, we find the increasing inability for his disciples to cope with it. This is one of the great things about Mark, is that he exposes us to the fact that the disciples didn't grasp everything right away. This shows us, can I just say this, just shows us the legitimacy of what we have in this account. It shows that this is authentic, that this is not some made-up fairy tale when we talk about Jesus walking upon water. This was an actual miracle. This took place in time and space, in history. The fact that Mark is so open and honest that the disciples didn't grasp everything shows the legitimacy of what we have before us. And so therefore, we don't have any reason whatsoever to question this text as we look at it this morning, even though it is something that would blow our minds. And it did the disciples. In chapter 6, verses 45 through 52, we have Jesus walking on the water. And it's interesting because this particular miracle has created such an intense interest in the post-Enlightenment. Okay? And let me give you a little bit of history, just a short little history lesson, all right? Starting with the Renaissance. Renaissance was the new birth. I mean, just the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, okay? The Renaissance was the new birth. It was the new age of learning, man's enlightenment. The irony of both of those. The Renaissance declaring the new birth. It is actually man steeping further into death. The Enlightenment was not really the Enlightenment, but was man moving further into his darkness and foolishness as they reject the supernatural. But the Renaissance started a movement, and basically in the Renaissance they set aside the medieval religious corporate approach to life, and they looked more at the modern individualistic view of life. The Reformation was trying to counter this. We have the Reformation turning people back to God, turning them back to the Word of God, this supernatural revelation that came from God. Now it's interesting because there was an emphasis in the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. The focus was on man and the world as opposed to God and heaven. There was this transition, if you will. They began to move from, if borrow the term from Francis Schaeffer, from the upper story to the lower story. They put aside the eternal, they put aside the things of God, they put aside grace, and they began to focus on the world, upon man, upon nature, upon time. This was a major transition in the history of the world, and it's impacted us, and it still impacts us today. We find it reverberating throughout society even now. With this movement came skepticism concerning the Bible and the supernatural. They began to question the reality of the revelation that we have. The secular humanists and their writings did much to undermine the faith in the Bible, the miracles, the divine revelation that we have. The Reformation counterbalanced this, bringing people back to the truth. The Enlightenment philosophy of the secular humanists laid a foundation for religious liberalism and its denial of supernaturalism. We find this in the liberal theologians, where they began to move towards science and that which was, they considered that you can only see by the senses. But the reality of it is, even science doesn't see everything by the senses and judge truth and reality by that. But there was this movement that began to happen, and it was undermining the Word of God. It was undermining the supernatural revelation. With that in mind, then many began to start with the premise that the laws of nature are inviolable. That somehow this system is closed and God cannot intervene into it and God can interact in it. And therefore, when we see things like this, there's no way that a human could walk upon the water. It's impossible. The deists believe even that God had created a system in which He locked Himself out of and could not enter into and had no control over. He just set it going and left it. They started with this premise and they started to move towards these passages, and they had to explain it rationalistically, setting aside the supernatural and setting aside the view that God can intervene into His world. And they began to try and explain Jesus walking on the water with this premise. I'll just tell you this. If anyone tries to tell you they're completely objective, it's a fallacy. It's a myth that one can be completely objective and that they have no presuppositions. Everyone has presuppositions when they come to truth or anything else that they see around them. Even scientists, they would like to have you think that they can set aside their presuppositions when they come to science and they're not tainted or polluted, or they don't have a premise already in mind. It's not true. Everyone has a presupposition. So they start with this premise of these things, these laws of nature. They are inviolable, and there's no way that God can intervene. And Albert Schweitzer, in his quest for the historical Jesus, he documents several scholars who judged this story, and they began to give their interpretations or explanations of it. And some said, well, this is just an optical illusion caused by Jesus walking along the seashore. We will find that this is not true in regards to this narrative. It's fascinating because notice verse 47. And when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then we're going to find him. Notice verse 49. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed that it was a ghost and cried out. This was no optical illusion. Some have tried to explain this as he was walking on a sandbar. That somehow there was a sandbar that reached all the way out into the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and he was walking upon this sandbar like he's going to find it in the evening time. The hours in which he was out there at the fourth watch was between 3 and 6. That this sandbar is actually going to stretch out to the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and he's going to be able to walk upon it. Problem with that is that the boat would have been beached if there was a sandbar there. Not only that, but why were the disciples so amazed and shocked and fearful when they saw Jesus walking on the water? If they've lived their whole life by the Sea of Galilee and they knew the waters and they knew what it was like, they would have known there was a sandbar. Therefore, they would not have been astonished. They would have thought, oh, hey, it's just Jesus walking on a sandbar. You see, the reality of it is, as we come to this text, you cannot escape it. As much as they want to rationalize it and sweep away the supernatural, the reality is there is no way of getting behind this account and suggesting any other explanation other than this was a supernatural feat. The reality of it is that this is such a clincher, right, in the minds of people, and ought to be. Out of all of the other miracles that Jesus Christ performed, this one stands out so unique. And it really is an answer to a question the disciples asked at the end of chapter 4 when they said, who is this that even the winds and the waves obey him? This is the answer. When in the midst of the storm, Christ says, it is I. It is I. I take you to this great miracle, and we find the setting, verses 45 and 46. And this is very closely connected. And we notice verse 45, immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and to go ahead of him to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. So we find this connection with the feeding of the 5,000. After that had taken place, he's going to send the crowds away. He's going to send the disciples over to the other side. It's interesting that in Matthew, Mark, and John, they all record this miracle happening right after the feeding of the 5,000. It's immediately connected in so many different ways. They are both very complementary, but notice verse 52. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. There was something that they should have learned from the feeding of the 5,000 that should enable them to respond in a different way when they saw Christ walking upon the water, but they failed to do so. There is a connection between the both of these, and they reveal the fact that Jesus is the powerful Son of God. I take you back to the beginning of Mark's gospel narrative as he lays out for us in chapter 1, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Up until this point, the only ones who have recognized him to be the Son of God were the demons as he cast them out. We have no utterance from any human lips that he is the Son of God. We'll have an affirmation from God the Father. We'll have the centurion servant at the end of Mark's gospel. He will reveal that he is the Son of God. But here, Jesus is making this clear to them. I am the powerful Son of God. These two miracles cause so many problems for so many secularists. And especially this one, the walking on the water. Because see, if we can't explain this away, then he had to be who he revealed himself to be. He is the Son of God. Therefore, he is what? He is deity. This is why they've tried so hard to dismiss this miracle, to try to put it away, to try and reinterpret it, to try and retranslate it. But there's no way to do that. It is very clear, very simple. It's amazing because with the feeding of the 5,000, we saw Jesus revealing himself as being the provider of the necessities of the physical and the spiritual. He felt compassion for them because they were sheep without a shepherd. He began to feed them with his teaching, and then he fed them with the loaves and the fish. He is the great provider, amen? He still continues to do that for us on a regular basis. This is why for my kids, I've always taught them we will stop and we will thank God before every meal, because whatever is on that table, God gave it to us. No matter what means he used to get it there, he is the one who got it there. The truth of this particular miracle is that Jesus is revealing that he is the deliverer of his people, not only physically, but ultimately spiritually from danger. He is the powerful Son of God, and this is the conclusion we must walk away from this particular miracle and the one before it. He is going to continue to make these things known to the disciples, and again, I remind you, he does things in twos. Ask yourself why. Why? Jesus is going to send the disciples away in verse 45. And there is a sense of urgency about this verse. Notice immediately in Mark, he likes to use this euthus. He likes to have this sense of immediacy that runs through this. But here it's very important because we find this urgency in regards to sending of the disciples away and the crowds. The Greek is very unusual here, and it means to compel them post haste. They need to get out of here in a hurry, and he dismisses them as soon as the feeding takes place. But Mark doesn't answer the question of why Jesus tells his disciples to get in the boat and leave in a hurry. John answers this, but Mark doesn't answer us this question. We can assume that possibly it was prevent them from getting involved in some sort of messianic movement. John makes it very clear that that is what was happening, that they recognized that Jesus was the prophet, and therefore they were going to force him to become their king. Mark doesn't touch on this, but we can still draw this conclusion from Mark's gospel when we look at the movement of the crowds and the excitement. I mean, even before the feeding of the 5,000, when Jesus wants to take the disciples away for a while in verse 31 of chapter 6, notice, for there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. All of a sudden, Mark moves us from aklos, crowds, to plethos, to multitudes, to here we have many coming and going, and we find that even when they go off to a secluded place, verse 33 of chapter 6, they can't even find any peace there because people find out where they're going and they run there to meet them. We find that there is a dangerous enthusiasm with the crowds in Mark's gospel, and it continues to escalate. And obviously, Jesus did not want his disciples to get caught up in any kind of messianic movement because they needed to understand the kind of Messiah he was. You see, everyone was looking forward to a political Messiah. They were looking forward to a physical deliverance. They were looking for him establishing Israel once again with their own king upon the throne. But what Jesus had to reveal to them is that he is a suffering Messiah, that he had to die, that he had to be rejected, and that he would rise again on the third day. He did not want his disciples swept away by the mindset of the people and enthusiasm. And for this very same reason also, he is going to send the crowds away. It's interesting because we find Jesus himself, he is dismissing them. Verse 45, he sends them away, and after bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. This is such an amazing moment, and it's interesting in Mark's gospel. We've talked about this before, but he does not tell us what the mountain is, the name of it. Twice he's referred to the mountain that Jesus went to. Obviously, there was a place where Jesus would retire to be by himself, to spend time with God the Father in communion. Mark notes Jesus praying only 3 times in his gospel. We've mentioned this before. The first time is in chapter 1, verse 35. The second time is here, and the last one is in chapter 14 at the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, just some thoughts for you, okay? All 3 occasions when Jesus withdraws to pray, some sort of crisis is involved. After the excitement and activity and the busy Sabbath in Capernaum, his disciples come to find him and they try to tell Jesus, look, all the people are looking for you. You got to come, right? They need more healing. People want to see you. And he says, no, we need to go to other villages also because I was sent to preach, you see. I need to keep focused on the mission. After the multiplication of the loaves we find a similar issue with the crowds coming. And then we finally find him in Gethsemane after the Lord's Supper in chapter 14. Each prayer is at night and in a lonely place. You see, what he had to go through Only he would fully understand. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, as he pours out his heart to God the Father and aligns himself with his will, right? Take this cup from me, but not my will, but thy will be done. You see, he knew what was coming. He knew it was coming. I mean, imagine where you would be and what you would do if you knew that suffering, great suffering, was going to come in your life to the point that you were going to die. You understand he's in humanity, right? He has human nature, and so therefore he knows what he experiences. He's going to feel it just like we would feel it. Each finds the disciples removed from him and failing to understand his mission. Each, Jesus faces a formative decision or a crisis. And each incident involves a temptation not to carry out God's mission, a mission which ultimately is going to lead to suffering, rejection, and death. And these crises seem to escalate. They build to a climax, which finally climaxes in the Garden of Gethsemane. 3 times and 3 times only does Mark mention Jesus Christ in prayer. 3 crucial moments in the life and ministry of Christ. The truth that we can walk away from is that we find that no matter what the stage of his life and ministry was, he always found time to pray. He had to spend time in communion with God the Father. Amazing truths for us as we walk and follow Christ as his disciples and seek to learn from him. Moments that we find him aligning his will with the will of God the Father. But now we move from the setting to the supernatural event that comes in verses 47 through 52. The disciples wrestling with the wind. We find them in the boat. In verse 47, and when it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land, and seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, and about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them. Now, Mark is going to use Roman timing, not Jewish timing, so it's the 4th watch as opposed to the 3rd watch. But it's interesting in Mark's gospel, whenever we find the disciples separate from Christ, we find them in distress. Isn't that the same for all of us, right? As Brandon was reminding us at prayer time this morning, every time we take our eyes off of Christ, trouble's going to come. We find ourselves slipping away. We find ourselves focused on the wrong things. We find ourselves distracted. We find ourselves distressed. Whenever we find the disciples not with Christ, we find them in distress. The Greek term that's used here, describing their straining at the oars in verse 48, it literally means to torment, and it's used in reference to demon possession oftentimes. And it can also be used, though, in reference to dire straits of other situations. The context, we understand that there isn't demon possession that is being dealt with here, but Mark is giving us a very vivid explanation as to the force of wind that they were facing as they were trying to row across the Sea of Galilee. Apparently facing a very strong headwind, and therefore they weren't making very good time getting across the Sea of Galilee. It's interesting because we found this something similar in chapter 4 when we had the incident of the disciples in the boat again. And in verse 39 of chapter 4, when Jesus rebuked the wind and he rebuked the sea and he told to hush and be still. These were terms that we found in reference to him casting out demons. And so some think that the first storm that we have in chapter 4, that it was by demonic forces that the wind and the waves were creating such a swell that it was beginning to fill up the boat and was going to sink the disciples. And I don't think that that is the point that is there. I think the point that is there is that Mark uses those terminologies because he wants to understand the nature of the situation. It wasn't merely a physical issue, it was a spiritual issue for the disciples. And Jesus is going to rebuke them for their lack of faith. So I don't think that here we're dealing with the issue of demonic forces, but Mark is using this to describe the vivid force of the waves as they pushed against the disciples. But notice the walking on the water. Verse 48, this is the centerpiece of this whole entire episode. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them. At about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. I just remind you, it's interesting, you look back in the Old Testament, there's so many ways in which God revealed himself and his character. Oftentimes, we come to understand God's attributes by the things that he does. It's interesting that I was reading in Proverbs talking about the wicked and they receive hateful things or vile things from the lips of others. You see, when you listen to such things, what does that say about your character is what that proverb warns us against. But it's fascinating when you look at the Old Testament, you find God revealing himself, not just in the names that he gives and revealing to the people who he is, but what he does makes it known. We find the same thing here in this self-revelation that Jesus Christ is going to give the disciples. He is going to reveal something unique about himself. Something that they failed to see in the breaking of the loaves and the fish, and something that they needed to see. And so therefore we have this double event that comes. They ask the question at the end of chapter 4. Jesus answers it here as he comes walking upon the water. But notice he was standing alone on the land as he watched them. Then as he sees them in the middle of the lake, he's going to come walking to them, about to pass by. Note the contrast in the reference to his positioning. In verse 48, as it talks about the fact that he is on the sea. This is the same preposition in the Greek that he uses in verse 47. This preposition means on, upon, or on the top of. He was on the top of water. He was not on a sandbar. He was on the water. If you look at verse 47, it's the exact same thing. Epiteskes, he was upon the land watching them, and then he walked out on the water. There is no way to retranslate this. There's no way to get behind it. What we have here is open water sustaining a human body. When we begin to see the miracles that Jesus Christ performs, whether it's talking about casting out demons, or whether it's providing food, or whether it's healing, or whether it's walking on the water, what we find is that the only one who could possibly do these things is the very one who created this universe. You see, there's no one who controls weather but who? God alone. There's no one who can heal the way that he does and restore the way that he does, but God alone. Only the one who created the universe could have such mastery and authority over the universe. The only one who could create the seas and all that could walk upon the water. This is a moment for the disciples to see and understand that he was the powerful Son of God. It's interesting because I was reflecting on this. Job chapter 9 verses 8 and 11. It's very fascinating because there's linguistic connections between this passage and Job. The exact same wording is used here that is used in the passage of Job. I give you this text from Job. God alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. When he passes me, I cannot see him. When he goes by, I cannot perceive him. It's amazing the terminology that is used here and in Job and the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. There's so much parallelism that happens in regards to what is going on. But I just take your mind to Job for a moment. It's very fascinating, that passage. In Job's quotation, it summarizes starting in chapter 9, verse 1 and following by recounting the awesome separation between God and humanity. God can do what humanity cannot do and can't even conceive of doing for Job. God cannot be conceived of in human categories. Any natural explanation of his acts is foolishness and pointless. That is the point that Job is making. We find here in this passage is the exact same truths. God is described in Job as being holy God and holy other. You see, the problem with Jesus' family, chapter 6, the first few verses, when he came to his hometown and everyone looked at him, this is the carpenter, right? Isn't this Mary's son? Here is his brothers and his sisters are still here, right? All they could do was see him in that category and they couldn't see beyond that. See, the problem is if we try to see Christ merely in just naturalistic categories and humanistic categories, we miss who he truly is. He is the Son of God. How many times do we put Jesus in categories he doesn't belong in? How many times do we do that when we face difficult situations in life? Go back to the feeding of the 5,000, right? We put him in categories. We look at the impossible and we say he can't do this, right? There's no way out of this. I remind you of Jairus and his daughter, right? Jesus tells Jairus, look, he gets the news that his daughter is dead, and they say, don't bother to teach her anymore. And Jesus says to Jairus, no, don't look at the circumstances, look at me. Do not let the circumstances define the limits of your faith. But how often does that happen with us?